Creating a Culture of Obedience, Part 2. And so as we get into this, I want to do a quick recap of what we talked about last week. And a big part of what I hope to get out of the discussion groups tonight is how did it go? You've learned some new tools. You've learned some maybe new ideas. You probably tried implementing them, and they were probably difficult. And there was probably challenges, and that's okay. So the goal will definitely be to talk about what was good, what was hard, and what can be done better, and then get some specific questions answered. But in the meantime, I do want to recap a few of the things we talked about last week, as well as talk about kind of a shotgun approach, a shotgun style to a lot of like miscellaneous topics within this topic. So again, going back to the idea of a culture of obedience, what do we mean when we want to create a culture of obedience? Generally, what we mean when we say a culture of obedience is that when we ask our kids to do something, they obey. Right? Now, no kid is going to be perfect, no child is going to be perfect, but we want to create environments in our home where the expectation is obedience, and that's followed through on. And if you have something other than that, you need to keep working and incrementally moving towards that direction, not just for the sake of your own sanity as parents, although that's huge, but also for the good of the children. As we talked about in week 1, obedience is not just so that we can be comfortable as parents. We're actually instilling in our children skills for their life and development. Now, one thing I want to just again pause and point out, and hopefully it's been said a couple times throughout the course of this class, is that there's no point or purpose or advantage in comparing yourself to any other family. This should be a space where we don't compare. This should be a space where we learn. This should be a space where we encourage one another, but comparing yourself to someone else is actually not beneficial in this situation, okay? And I think a lot of growth mentality is hindered by comparison, whether it's growth in physical fitness, growth in business, growth in any number of, learning a skill, even if I want to become a great piano player, right? What is that famous story of the great piano player that was jealous of, I think it was Mozart, right? He was fantastic for his time, but jealous of Mozart, and ended up, I think, killing himself. I'll have to go look that up and maybe bring it next week. But it's very much a thing where if you're constantly comparing yourself to someone else, you're going to become dissatisfied and discouraged. And so wherever you're at, the most important thing to do is to take an inventory of where you're at today and make incremental or small changes in the direction you want to go. Because over time, no matter where you start, if you make small changes in the direction you want to go, you'll be shocked at how far you will get in how short amount of time. So don't compare. This is not a place to get jealous. This is not a place to one-up each other. This is a place to be encouraged and to everybody just figure out where you're at and make steps in the right direction. Make steps in the right direction. As the body of Christ, we've all been given different gifts, abilities, talents, and things to bring to the table, and every single one of you in this room does that in a very unique and meaningful way for this body. And so truly, comparison is going to be the enemy of progress, not the friend. We talked last week about trying to avoid excessive tricks, tips, and bribes for modifying children's behavior. If you're taking every parenting situation and trying to figure out how can I manipulate my child into obeying in this situation, you're going to exhaust yourself, and the child will never learn true obedience. Now, I did want to make a caveat to that because some tools, tips, or training mechanisms are okay. And maybe I came down a little bit too hardlined on that, and I realized that in the discussion last week. So Amber, for example, says she will do something, when the boys do something without being asked, and it's positive for the culture of the family or the household, they get a penny. And then at the end of the week or the end of the month, they can use those pennies to purchase some sort of goodie or treat or go get ice cream or whatever. And so I would ask immediately, is that using some manipulation, tip, bribery to get your children to modify their behavior? And the answer is maybe. Maybe. Because you certainly could modify behavior that way, because when that 8-9-year-old becomes a 12, 13-year-old, maybe you need to give them dollars. And then when we become 18, maybe you need to give them fivers, $5 bills. And maybe then they just straight up rebel and say, I don't care about the money because I can go get a job, right? So if you're not shepherding their heart along the way in the situation and not using the training tool to actually address the heart issues, then yes, that's probably a bad idea. I know Joey and Amber, and I don't think that's what's happening in the slightest. They're, I'm sure, using that tool to help motivate their children towards obedience and then eventually being able to remove that tool because the tool has taught something in the child's heart, okay? So again, I wanted to make sure I was clarifying I'm not against all tips, tricks, fun. That's just a fun thing too, and giving things, if you're so domineering where it's like, I have no joy, no energy, just do what I say, this is the military, right? We've all either experienced those situations or we can imagine what that would be like. That's not what I'm advocating for. But what I'm advocating for is truly a heart transformation in your child so that they understand obedience, right? If a tool, tip, trick, even a bribe, is leading them to understand the idea of obedience, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that as long as it's to that end. So use that as you will and try to be discerning on what you're using to move your kids' hearts. Again, I want to emphasize the definition of obedience. It's not just technically doing what you say. And kids, especially as they get into the 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they're gonna want to be technical with you. Well, technically, you said I couldn't have another cookie, but you didn't say I couldn't have candy. Or the whole, I'm not touching, I didn't touch my sibling, I just put my hand 1 inch from their face, right? Kids will start thinking, technically. So that's not even what we mean by obedience. We mean, yes, do what I say, but also right away, all the way, and with a happy heart. This is the definition of obedience we use here. I didn't make it up, I stole it. I would also say with older kids, I would say, do what I say right away, all the way with a good attitude. Happy heart is much easier for younger kids to understand. And of course, last week we talked about the 3 C's. I think the kind of steps to create a culture of obedience is to have clarity, and that means clear expectations. What do you want your child to do? And again, your children are not mind readers. They are not mind readers. If you do not tell them what you want from them, there's zero chance, well, that's not zero, but a very low chance they'll obey because they don't even know what you want, right? So you need to give your children clarity for their sake. You need to give your children consequences, and the consequences also need to be clear, and preferably the consequences, whenever possible, need to be clarified before the situation even comes up. Right? Now, sometimes disobedience happens and you need to bring a consequence and the consequence was never talked about. But the best case scenario is that you have situations, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute, where the expectation has been clearly laid out, the consequence has been clearly laid out, and then you consistently apply that rule and the consequence. Right? And the last C is consistency. So notice that the 3 C's are all things that we, the parents, do, not the kids. So a culture of obedience is primarily the responsibility of the parents, right? If your kids aren't obedient, you can be mad at the kids, you can be frustrated at the kids, but ultimately we need to take responsibility and say, I'm the one that's not being clear with my expectations or consistent with my consequences, or maybe even consistent with the process, right? Because when we do those 3 things, the child will naturally become obedient. So the obedience, we need to own it. We need to own it and say, yes, we can do this, and it's our responsibility to train our children. Okay? And lastly, we kind of answered the question of where should I start? If you're in a place of chaos and disorder, where should I start? And I kind of brought to mind or brought to the forefront of the conversation the idea of command-based obedience versus rule-based obedience. And command-based obedience is where you want to start with your children. Command-based obedience is the idea that if you ask them to do something directly, then that thing gets done at that moment, right? And obedience is followed through. There's going to be a lot of other situations and other things you want your kids to do because you don't want to go through life always having to ask them to do everything, right? Eventually, you want your child to get to the point where they don't tease their sister, and you don't say, well, you didn't tell me not to tease my sister today. Well, no, I'm just going to tell you one time, don't tease your sister. That's the rule from now to eternity, right? So that's different, right? So the command-based obedience is you're in the car. Your one child is probably the older one, unless it's Killian and Benaiah, maybe it's the younger one, is teasing their sibling, right? Is that true, Joey? Yeah. So you have one sibling teasing the other sibling, and you ask them, hey, you need to stop teasing your sibling. That's command-based obedience, and they need to stop right now. That's a battle, if you're in the early stages of obedience, that you want to fight, right? You want to make sure you win that battle. Now, if a child is teasing their sibling, and it hasn't been discussed, but there was a rule that you talked about last week, maybe you put a pin in that, and you still do the correction, you still do the training, but you're not necessarily focused on that level of obedience because maybe your child is not even to the point where they can obey a command. Does this make sense? Rule-based obedience has to be built on command-based obedience. It's not reasonable to expect your child to have a catalog of rules that they need to obey if they can't even obey a simple command. Right? So there's all sorts of things that I would put in the rule-based obedience category, right? General politeness or civility, right? There's certain ways we just want our kids to act when they're at the dinner table, when they're at the grocery store, when they're in the car, when they're at church, when you're walking to the library, when you're walking to the car, or 1,000 other things, right? Just this is how you should conduct yourself in public, right? Some of those things need to be addressed over time, but until you have a foundation of command-based obedience, you're not going to be able to build on that foundation with rule-based obedience, right? So you might, again, why am I saying this? If you look at your situation and you think, my life is a land of lawlessness, there's no rules. Okay, there's no rules. Start with command-based obedience only. Focus on that and get them to obey there, and then slowly start implementing the rules. And then once that culture is being established, you can build up rules over time, right? Again, picking on Joey and Amber a lot tonight for some reason, but they said the whole example of, I want my boys to be good listeners, right? I don't want them slouching or rolling on the floor or looking around. Like when an adult is talking to them, particularly their parents, you need to be, listening, right? Or a big one in our household is responding, yes, Mom, yes, Dad, not K. Hey, can you please go do this? K. It's like, no, yes, Mom, right? And then obey, right? So, or any number of other rules, right? But you're not, if you say, oh man, my kids don't respond with yes, Mom, I better get on it. No, get the command-based obedience first, and then start building on the rules. Is that helpful? Okay, so I want to cover a handful of kind of, I don't want to say miscellaneous, but kind of subpoints, and they really don't build on each other as much as it's kind of a lot of miscellaneous things that I want to talk about creating a culture of obedience. So the first and maybe most significant is this idea of defiance. Defiance is the idea that of willful disobedience, willful rejection of authority, or willful rejection of a rule. Okay? Defiance starts at a super young age. It's when a child knows the rule, knows what you asked, and distinctively and deliberately does the other thing. Okay? Anybody, this has happened? Yeah? Yeah. So what I would say about defiance is it has to be a battle that you choose to fight. So with children, just like any relationship, you've heard the idea of pick your battles, right? Especially in the early stages, you can't fight every battle. But as parents, if you choose to fight a battle, you need to make sure you win. Because if you fight a battle and lose, you've trained the child that they can overcome you, especially given enough time. And this is where, again, parents can really fall down, is a parent will choose to pick a battle with a child. They'll throw a fit, a temper tantrum, roll on the floor, cry, throw their cereal on the floor, or any other number of ways to literally wage war against your soul. And you, after 30 minutes of this, or an hour of this, or 3 hours of this, give up. And if it's been 3 hours of throwing a fit and rolling on the floor, then I would again implore you, do not lose that battle. Because again, the moment you lose that battle, you've just trained your kid, do whatever you want, and eventually I'll just let you do it. If you win that battle every time, you will be shocked at how quickly they will stop that battle, right? Now, I'm not saying you can't employ different strategies or approaches to how you're going to win that battle, but you need to make sure at the end of that, you're still the one in charge, and they know that you are the one making the rules and not them, okay? So defiance, in my opinion, is something that absolutely needs to be addressed all the time and every time, right? You just can't afford to let your kids be defiant, I would say almost ever. There's not really a situation, and maybe when the kids get older, you can address it later. But if I was on my way to work and there was a situation of defiance, I would address it before I go to work. Or maybe if my child was old enough, I would make sure I addressed it when I get home, right? But I wouldn't just say, man, I've got to go to work, this one's going to slide, and never circle back around to it. It's just too important. It's too important. It needs to be addressed every time without exception. And the reason is the defiance is the willful disobedience, right? Now, kids are going to mess up. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to cross boundaries they shouldn't. They're going to do, acts of passion, right? They're going to get really mad and disobey. Getting mad and disobeying is different than that side eye. Like, I know the rule. I just don't think you're going to do anything about it. And then they do it. You cannot allow that to happen, right? And again, I think some of you possibly might be thinking, well, my child does this all the time. I can't imagine fighting every act of defiance. What I would say to that is you have to. And if you start now and are consistent, even for a weekend, if both parents say, okay, this weekend, we will not allow any acts of defiance in our home, by the end of that weekend, I think you'll see a drastic shift in culture because kids will have the culture of defiance, the culture of obedience will be reset, right? And once you establish, I will not be defied, they just aren't defiant as much anymore, right? And then when they are, you can really sniff it out easy and you can address it immediately and keep that completely out of the culture of your home, okay? So defiance, again, is that willful disobedience. Not crimes of passion, but crimes of intent, of thought, of purpose, right? It must always be addressed. The other thing I would say about the whole situation of obedience is that when you're doing the 3 C's properly, you're setting your children up to succeed. In fact, skip down 2 slides, Levin, to that slide. I'm going to jump there first. Set your children up for situations to succeed, okay? And again, what I mean by that is if you don't give your kids clear expectations and clear consequences and you don't consistently enforce those rules, they're not going to have a very good chance of succeeding, right? And so you want to bring as much clarity to the situation as you can. But here's the cool thing. If you bring clarity to a rule, it puts the burden of obedience on the child, not on you to figure out whether they're being defiant. Okay, so what I mean by this is if you are very clear with your child, hey, in church, you're driving to church, you say, in church, I want you to sit on your chair this morning. I don't want you to get on the floor and play. I don't want you to talk to your sister and brother. I just want you to sit on your chair and listen to the sermon. Do you understand? You acknowledge there's understanding. Confirm receipt. And then you're walking into church and you remind them, right when you sit down, it's like, okay, the sermon is about to start. I want you to sit on your chair and listen. I don't want you getting on the floor, and I don't want you talking to your sister. If you do that, I'm going to take you out to the car calmly, and I'm going to give you a spanking. Do you understand? Now, the child understands. Now, sermons can be long, right? Maybe they're genuinely forgot, right? So maybe it's not an act of defiance, but most likely it is. And you can even help them, right? They're starting to get on the floor. Hey, Billy, remember the rule? Remember what I said? Oh, yeah. So they're either going to say, oh, yeah, and get back on their chair, which again, praise the Lord, that's an act of obedience, right? Or what are they going to do? Continue to disobey, but now what is that? An act of defiance. So you've just, by making the expectations extremely crystal clear, made it so that they can either obey or defy. So you've almost polarized their behavior. Either they're going to obey or they're going to defy you. And that makes discipline extremely easy. To me, the most difficult situations to discipline are the ones where you don't know, right? Because I don't want to punish my kid if they just truly forgot, right? If they truly made a mistake, I make mistakes, and I don't want to be punished for an honest mistake. That feels terrible, right? So I don't want to get in a situation where it's like, well, I told them 2 weeks ago that they couldn't get on the floor, and now they're on the floor. Like, did they remember that I said that? You know, and again, if it's Levin, he probably can remember for 2 weeks that I told him not to get on the floor in church. You know, but if it's a younger child, maybe not, right? Like, you have to be reminded of those sorts of rules. So by bringing clarity, you're making it so that they either have to obey or have to defy. And if they choose defiance, then it's very easy to execute the discipline. So when I say set up situations for your child to succeed, I could have also put up the opposite, which is set up situations for your child to fail. I'm not saying you should set it up for them to fail. I'm saying set it up for them to succeed, but also if you set it up for them to succeed, it'll be very obvious when they fail or if they fail. Does this make sense? What you're trying to do is bring crystal clear clarity. And what I would say is if you're new to this and you didn't make it clear, I would not execute punishment. I would own that for yourself, make a mental note, and do a better job next time. Because again, if you didn't make it clear and then you discipline your kid, they're going to be confused, anxious, upset, and the relationship will be hurt more than anything. So set up situations for your child to succeed. Last week I talked about Jane's thing, and I think she got this probably from a book. All this stuff we probably got from books at some point eventually, right? But sometimes giving your child and feeding them literally the lines to say and the behaviors they're going to do before the thing happens is helpful. That's setting them up for success. Hey, Jack, in 2 minutes, I'm going to ask you to go get your jams on. When I ask you to go get your jams on, you're going to stand up and say, yes, Mom, and then you're going to run to your room and put on your jams. Now you've not only told him what you're going to do, you've told him what you expect him to do and how you expect him to do it, right? You're literally spoon-feeding your kid the answer to the test. And then again, you're setting them up to succeed, but if they don't do that, now the defiance has become perfectly clear. And so the discipline then becomes extremely easy. And they are also not confused because they know why they're being disciplined. Right? So it's a win-win-win. It's a win for everybody. I want to talk again, because it's so important, to never, ever discipline from a position of anger. If you're angry, you should probably calm yourself down before you engage in disciplining your children. Because the line truly from discipline to punishment, or even from punishment to child abuse, is rather small. Right? The discipline is for the children's admonition and bringing up and raising up and training. And you do not want to be disciplining angry. You do not want to be hurting them because they hurt you, right? You're the parent, they're the child. Discipline isn't effective when you're angry because you're not even communicating the thing that you want to communicate. You're not teaching them obedience, right? And so I would say if anger is cropping up a lot, you need to just pause, stop, and get your own heart under control, get your own emotions under control, because it's literally impossible to discipline and raise your children if you're angry at them at that moment. Now, I understand emotions are real, frustrations are real. That's something you need to pray through, work through, fight through, to be able to get that under control so that you can discipline from a place of calm. Because what you're trying to communicate to the kid is not, I don't like you, it's your decisions have consequences. Right? It's not, I'm mad at you. It's not, I need to hurt you because you hurt me. It's not, I'm frustrated with you, so get out of my sight. It's, if you do this, then this will happen. This is the way of the world. Right? Decisions, behaviors, they have consequences, and you cannot do that from a position of anger. Children, all of them that I've ever known, they want to naturally test limits. And so you need to be aware of this and watching for it. And I've even seen Kylo do it, right? Baby 1.5-year-old Kylo is already testing limits and figuring out what she can and can't do, right? So they do this from a super, super young age. And honestly, a lot of parents think it's cute and it's funny. And honestly, the problem is that it's cute and it's funny until it's not, right? And until they learn disobedience, and then it's really not cute and funny, And then they're teenagers that have no understanding of boundaries, rules, guidelines, and it's extremely destructive, right? So God has put limits on us for our good. We put limits on our children for their good. You need to be aware of when your child is testing limits, because testing limits is actually a small version of defiance, right? And if it's a true limit that they're testing and you really think it's unclear, maybe just bring some clarity. Hey, Johnny, I see that, I told you not to go by the fence, and now you're getting pretty close to the fence. Like, I need you to take a step back, right? Whatever the rule is, right? So if there's true, if there's a true lack of clarity on a rule or a command, bring the clarity, right? And then see what they do. You're always trying to create situations for them to succeed or creating situations where they clearly defy. I do want to, again, I said this is going to be kind of some random thoughts all sprinkled through, talk about spanking a little bit more. I do personally think that spanking is an extremely effective means of discipline. I want to say for 99% of children. I'm not going to go ahead and say 100% of children because there probably are exceptions out there, but especially young children, spanking is effective. Nobody likes to be hurt physically, and a spanking is exactly that. It needs to be physical pain. Now, some kids are really tough. Some kids get adrenaline going, and they don't seem hurt. And if you spank your child and they don't seem hurt, then you're not spanking them right, okay? Also, when adrenaline's up and everybody's mad and everybody's flustered, right, you can literally hit them, spank them, and again, they probably don't feel it because you're mad, their adrenaline's going. It's just a brawl, right? They hit you back, you hit them again, you spank them again. I mean, it's an all-out brawl. This is not spanking, right? So parents that tell me spanking doesn't work, I want to know a lot more details, okay? I want to know a lot more details because nobody likes to be spanked, and nobody is tough enough to get a spanking and not hurt, right? An effective spanking, again, maybe talk in your groups about this. Maybe some of these things will be controversial. I don't really care. An effective spanking is on the skin, and preferably on the butt, and preferably with a wooden spoon or a plastic spoon or something that has a fairly large surface area, right? You don't want to spank them with a ballpoint hammer that's going to cause serious damage. Something with a lot of surface area, like a spoon, a plastic spoon or a wooden spoon, the classic wooden spoon, right? Why is that effective? It spreads the area of the strike, but provides a lot of sting. You do it on the bare bottom because it stings. It hurts, and you do it hard enough that it hurts. And you should do it in a calm enough situation where there's not adrenaline going most of the time, right? The best and most effective spankings are calm and collected, and if they understand why they're receiving the discipline. Hey, I told you this was the rule, and I told you if this rule is broken, you're going to get a spanking. And that's when the begging starts. Please don't spank me. Please don't spank me. I don't want to spank you, and I'm sorry, but this is the consequence for this rule, right? And then in a calm and collected way, you deliver the spanking with clarity, and it's clearly happening, and it's not communicating anger, it's not communicating frustration, it's communicating you broke the rule, and I'm a man of my word. If I said I was going to spank you, I'm going to spank you. I think spankings are the most effective on younger children. I think that kids do grow out of spankings sometimes relatively quickly. Maybe even 2 to 5, 2 to 6. I really think that's the most effective time for spanking. Sometimes longer than that. But maybe you can use other things. But honestly, a lot of times 3-year-olds don't even understand other consequences. If I disobey me, I'm going to take this toy away. Well, they've got a million toys, right? Everybody understands a spanking. If you want to talk more about how to do an effective spanking, let's talk about it in the groups, right? I will also say, again, reiterate what I said last week, if you're frustrated and spanking in anger, it is crossing over into child abuse. So as much as I'm serious about spanking being a great idea, it's also super evil if you're hitting your kids because you're mad at them. That is not why you spank. That is wrong. And the world now has come against the church and anybody that's trying to discipline their kids because kids do get beat and abused. So I'm not advocating for you to beat or abuse your kids. I'm advocating for you to calmly execute discipline and consequences. And again, I hear it all the time, spanking doesn't affect my child. Then you are the one that is doing it wrong. Because I promise you there is not a single person in the world that doesn't like to be, that's okay with being hit. That does not make sense to me. Other means of discipline are effective, but you need to know your child for that. And they become more effective as they get older, right? Again, at a young age, there's almost just nothing else that's as effective as a spanking. But maybe there is, and maybe kids understand, but again, you take dessert away from a baby and they're just gonna flip out. Like they just don't have enough cognitive ability to understand and connect the fact that everybody's eating ice cream and they're not, because they forgot about the thing that they did 15 minutes ago, right? But a 7-year-old probably can't understand that, right? So somewhere along the line, you can do that. And again, the older you get, you, as much as possible, want to tie natural consequences to the behavior, right? So if they do something wrong and there was an actual real consequence to it, you need to tie them to that consequence. You wrote on the wall, you're going to clean the wall, and it's going to take you an hour to scrub it off with a sponge, right? Tying natural consequences to the behavior. We talked about this last week, and I'm going over on time, so I'm going to skip this, but never count. If you forgot why, watch the video last week or ask in your group. Never, ever, ever count. We talked about this again last week, so again, I'll go through it quickly, but if you're getting frustrated, being frustrated is normal. It's natural. It's going to happen in parenting, but a lot of the times, you're frustrated because you didn't clearly make the expectations and you haven't clearly or quickly enough executed the consequences. By the time you got frustrated, they've probably disobeyed you 7 times. And if you don't do anything for 7 times, they're just going to get momentum going. And now you're pulling your hair out because you didn't follow through with the consequence. So I don't want to say it's always your fault. Sometimes life is just hard, okay? Something broke, a pipe broke, and the basement's flooded, and blah, 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 and somebody dropped off their kid, and there's just 1,000 things outside your control. Like, I get it. Life can be frustrating. But if you're just in this place where your kids are constantly disobeying, and then you wait to correct them until you're frustrated at them, that means you waited too long. So that's really what I'm trying to say is don't wait till you're frustrated to correct your children. Correct them while you're still calm. Don't wait. And of course, expectations change as kids grow up. One thing I wanted to talk about was the why. When do you owe your kids an explanation? This, I think, was a question that Pastor Matt had asked last time we did this question, or last time we did this class, is when do I answer the question why? And do I owe my kids an explanation? So especially when they're young, I would just say you don't. You don't owe them an explanation, and mostly you don't tell them why. Because, quite frankly, they can't understand. And most of life is far too complicated for your child to understand. So if you give them some picture of reality that's false anyway, you're not doing them any favors or yourself. You're just teaching them, I only have to obey when I understand the reason, right? This was a big deal with Levin. He really was okay with obeying when he understood why the rule was in place. But if he didn't understand the rule, he didn't want to obey it. He was even okay with being disciplined if he thought and understood that he had broken a rule. But if he thought that the rule was stupid, then he thought he shouldn't get disciplined, right? So, it's only, and there's things now even where I have to tell Levin a rule, and he's 13 now, and he just has to trust me on the rule, because he's 13. There's things about the world he doesn't understand and can't understand. Now, am I having a lot more why conversations with Levin, even than I am with Alette, than Eric would be with Kylo, a 1.5-year-old baby? Yes, right? So definitely as your child's getting older, the why does come into play, but what you do need to fight against is the idea that the kid wants to only obey if they agree with you, right? And the reality of this, there's a much bigger picture going on. God asks us to do things that we don't always understand, and we need to take by faith. And he says his ways are higher than our ways, as high as the heavens are above the earth, right? So the gap between your knowledge and your child's knowledge is smaller than the gap between God's knowledge and our knowledge. What a cool picture, right? But God asks us to obey anyway. And if we can raise children that understand this idea and are okay with that obeying by faith and being patient and waiting on the Lord, they can learn those things under your leadership, under your stewardship, right? And so we don't owe our children explanations, and we certainly don't want to predicate obedience on it. My wife is really good about, you need to obey first, and then we can talk about it. I'm pretty sure I've heard her say those words a lot of times. You need to obey now, and then maybe later we can talk about it, right? This puts the obedience before the explanation. And this is really important. Again, the younger the age, the more this is important. And again, eventually, the kid gets to an age where you want to teach them to respectfully question, right? And that's okay, but again, it's not 6, it's probably more like 12 or 13, where you're teaching them what does it mean to respectfully say, hey, I was actually almost done with this thing. Would it be all right if I had 15 more minutes before I did X, Y, Z, or whatever the case may be? You know, is that helpful? Does that make sense? When to explain the why? Last thing, and I'll end with this, I think this has been long, is that our families of origin really drastically affect the way we discipline. Even the whole conversation I just had about spanking, if you grew up in an abusive household or an overly domineering household, that's going to sound really harsh and really hard. And I want to acknowledge that, but what I do want to say is that we need to, through community and through conversation and through these groups, shed off what was bad and adopt our own philosophy of parenting, because we all have different and varying degrees of baggage that we brought from our parents. Some good, some bad, some really bad, right? And so your perception of discipline, your perception of spanking, your perception of rules, your perception of being domineering, all those things are going to change based on how your parents raised you. So this is just something, again, it's way too complicated to address all of the situations and the possible situations from here. But what I would say is if you're hearing things from me that are making you uncomfortable, talk about it with me or somebody in your group or somebody that you know and trust and love, right? Because we can certainly be impacted by the way we were raised on how we want to raise our children, right? And again, maybe some of those things are good, but I would venture a guess that a lot of the things that are making you prickle at some of these responses are probably bad. And they're dragging stuff from your past now into your family, and you need to be the one to cut that off at the root and address it so that your kids can be in a new cycle of health and